Right, I think we'll press on. If I can introduce Ted Bromund, perhaps would like to just briefly introduce himself and respond.
Thank you very much. It's really a tremendous pleasure to be with you here today. My name is Ted Bromund. I work at the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. For those of you who don't know the Heritage Foundation, we're online at www.heritage.org. We are the largest American conservative think tank, and therefore I would presume the largest conservative think tank in the world. We have about 300 staff and about 700,000 individual dues-paying members in the United States. One of my colleagues is here as well, who will be speaking in a panel a little bit later today. We're tremendously glad to have the opportunity to come here. I'm a frequent visitor to the United Kingdom, but just representing Heritage, it's a tremendous pleasure to have the opportunity to meet with so many friends and allies in the United Kingdom. And we at Heritage view all of the organizations that are participating and helping out here today, and all the individuals up here on the podium as well, to be really important friends and allies of liberty in Britain, in Europe, for the United States and around the world. Let me just respond briefly to Donald's comment, and then just say a few very sort of more general comments, really in sort of reflection, not really response to what Dan said. I wrote this quote down from Winston Churchill because I thought this question of foreign policy might just come up. This is from a speech that Churchill gave at Harvard. As a Yale man, I'm very sorry about that, but some things can't be undone. September 6th, 1943. And Churchill was responding to the question of why did the United States get involved in World War II, and shouldn't it just after the war was over return to what might loosely be called isolationism? Churchill said the following, quote, "The price of greatness is responsibility. If the people of the United States had continued in a mediocre station, struggling with the wilderness, absorbed in their own affairs and a factor of no consequence in the movement of the world, they might have remained forgotten and undisturbed beyond their protecting oceans. But one cannot rise to be in many ways the leading community in the civilized world without being involved in its problems, without being convulsed by its agonies, and inspired by its causes." I think those words are just as true today as when Churchill spoke them. I have tremendous sympathy with the practical import of much that Donald said, but I think that we, both of our nations, are ultimately deluding ourselves if we think that we can forever be isolated from, remove ourselves from, be undisturbed and unmoved by troubles and toils in other parts of the world. For better or for worse, as leading members of the civilized world, that is not what we are. And I think it is ultimately wrong to wish away the traditions that give ourselves those impulses. Of course, we have to be careful how we exercise them. Of course, we have to be prudent. Of course, we have to make choices. Saying you have responsibilities does not tell you how you have to fulfill them. But ultimately, those sense of responsibilities, that sense of involvement in the world's troubles, stems from precisely the traditions that Dan talked about. And to wish away that sense of responsibility is to wish away the traditions of freedom, and ultimately to play the left's game. Because the left would like nothing better than to see the United States and the United Kingdom be nations of no account in the struggles of the world. And when people on the right go beyond the question of prudence to advocating isolationism, then I think we do end up playing the left's game. Now, just a few words about more current controversies. I'm very glad that Dan made the point that he made about exporting costs and exporting taxation, because this is going to be a very live issue in U.S.-European relations in the not-too-distant future. I'm very concerned, and I know Iain is very concerned, with something called TTIP, which is the U.S.-EU free trade area negotiations, and largest possible quotes around free trade area here. We in the United States on the conservative side see these still fairly nascent negotiations as an effort to export Europe's job-killing and economic-killing model to one of the world's more competitive economies. And I think there is going to be extremely strong conservative resistance in the United States against this sort of deal. Now, that being said, I, and I know my colleague, are profoundly convinced supporters of genuine free trade. But the EU is not a free trade organization. It is a managed market organization. And I find myself profoundly unconvinced that this would be a wise step for the United States. Finally, on the question of competition, which I think Dan was very right to raise, I would add, in a broader sense, that we are tremendously good now at subsidizing on the individual level, on the national level, and on the international level, uncompetitive behavior. If you think about the kind of competition that Dan spoke about, wars in the past had a winner and a loser. There was a price for being a national failure, and that price could be national or dynastic extinction. Nowadays, as soon as a war begins, we rush in with mediation and negotiation and let's settle it. You know, all this is a tremendous credit to our humanitarianism, no doubt about it. But it removes the spur of competition and the fear of loss from the international state system, and that observation can be extended down to the national level and to the individual level, where analogous policies, primarily in the welfare area, tend to subsidize irresponsibility and failure. I would argue that the spur of competition is vital on every level of human behavior, from the national all the way up to the international. And if we want a more responsible citizenry, if we want more responsible, efficient, democratic, and free nations, and if we want an international state system which lives up to the very basic rules of the road, which were largely invented by the United Kingdom and then propagated to and supported for a century by the United States, that we need to do much more to restore the spur of competition and be a little less concerned on every level with subsidizing and defending failure. Thank you.
Well, very much like Donal, I agree with Dan and I agree with Ted. It falls to me to talk about defending freedom on the home front. We've talked a lot about defending freedom abroad, but freedom is very much under threat in the United Kingdom and the United States. Those twin pillars of freedom in the world. It's under freedom is under threat in a way that we haven't really seen since, I think, the 17th century. There's a wonderful line in that great Bill of Rights, 1689, not the American imitation, which says that the pretended power of suspending the laws or the execution of laws by regal authority is illegal. Last week, the President of the United States suspended the execution of a law. Not just any law, the Obamacare law, the law that is his flagship policy. He suspended the execution of one of the introductions of what's called the individual mandate. It's a very complicated issue. I'm sure you don't want to hear about Obamacare. Goodness knows we hear enough about it in the States. But it's this very fact that the President felt able to stop a law going through being executed. And he did so without a murmur from the mainstream media or his own supporters. That suggests to me that liberty is under threat in America now in a way that it has not been since, well, 1689. Executive power is on the rise all over the world. And the reason why it's on the rise is because we've allowed it. Going back to the 17th century again, in the instrument of government that established the Protectorate, Parliament was then known as the Keepers of Liberty. They weren't called a legislature. In fact, the word legislator didn't really, as we now know it, didn't really come into existence until the next century, the 18th century. We have to think of the people that we elect to Parliament or to Congress as the keepers of liberty. They need to think of themselves as the keepers of liberty. But this is something that they have resolutely failed to do over the past 30, 40 years. They've delegated their guardianship of liberty to the very people who are guaranteed to abuse it. A great example is the Environment Agency. here in the United Kingdom. The Environment Agency was set up in order to protect the environment. What it did was give lots of jobs to the environmental movement, the transnational green movement, and proceed to destroy the environment. The floods that we've seen in the southwest of England are directly, the Environment Agency is directly responsible for those. And it is appalling that nobody has actually seriously got up and started, within the Conservative government, has seriously got up and suggested that we abolish the Environment Agency. We see exactly the same thing in the United States, where its mirror image, the Environmental Protection Agency, is a rogue agency, completely out of control. My organisation, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which focuses on regulation and does a lot of work on energy and environment issues, we found a tape of an EPA regional administrator, a chap called Iain Murrary, who was boasting to his employees that when the EPA came to town, they did what the Romans did. They picked the first 10 businesses they saw and crucified them. In order to make, crucified them on a cross of green, basically, in order to make these businesses much more compliant, the businesses that remained, much more compliant with EPA's orders. We're seeing this across the board. Agency after agency is accruing powers to itself and destroying liberty. And I think, therefore, that when we talk about freedom abroad, we need to think much more about freedom at home as well. We can't be that shining city on a hill that President Reagan used to talk about, an exemplar of liberty to the rest of the world, if we are destroying liberty at home. So, you gentlemen and ladies here who have come to this organisation, you should be the keepers of liberty. Please go out and spread the message of liberty to your friends and families, and try and get your members of Parliament to do something about the abuse of executive power. It's the most important issue facing us domestically, I believe.